I gave my very first technical talk at an AAPG Southwest section about 30 years ago. And as I was preparing for this talk today, I realized then as now, I was talking about Paleozoic dolomites. It's a great privilege to share with you some lessons learned over many years how the lower Ordovician carbonates produce in some of the most unusual and exciting reservoirs and traps. The reservoirs often have bit drops. They confound petrophysicists. Traps include types from large structures to unconformity traps. This is a great historical producing formation. Over its 100 years of producing, there are many lessons with new technology that we think can offer the explorer of today opportunities to find new fields and also to better develop the fields that have already been found. The primary focus of this talk is a chapter on the oil and gas resources of the Great American Carbonate Bank as part of AAPG's new memoir, number 98, The Great American Carbonate Bank. And shown are two great carbonate geologists in the lower right, and this volume was dedicated to James Lee Wilson. Now, some of the key strategies that are important about the lower Ordovician. I knew to do this chapter right, we had to get up-to-date production data, and thanks to IHS, they were willing to share their databases. One of the important things about the carbonate reservoirs is to think in terms of a petroleum system, that in addition to the carbonate reservoirs, what the source rock and seal that's juxtaposed to the reservoirs is very important in understanding how the petroleum system works. And the unconformity at the top, the Sauk-Tippecanoe unconformity, plays a major role in karst imprinting and in trapping and migration. You can see on the left that the Great American Carbonate Bank extends into Canada and Greenland, but the heartland, if you will, of the mid-continent of the U.S. is where the primary production to date has been, and the oil and gas geologists will recognize formations like Ellenberger, Arbuckle, Knox, Prairie du Chien, Beekmantown. This illustration shows where all the production is from the IHS database, and you can see that here in Fredericksburg, we're really not very far away from the main production of these Ordovician carbonates. Basically, there are about 3,650 fields, and these carbonate reservoirs produce approximately 7.7 billion barrels equivalent, at least that much, and there may be additional production that was early production that wasn't captured in the record keeping. Most of this production is oil, and of course, under current economic conditions, this is a very timely topic. Looking at the approximately 30 basins in which the Cambrian-Ordovician produces, two basins really stand out on the left part of the chart. That would be the Permian Basin and the Central Kansas Uplift, with 5 billion and 2 billion barrels equivalent. In the middle, there are about a dozen or more fields that basically have produced 10 to 100 million barrels. And on the far right are some basins that are, if you're an optimist, they are potentially underexplored areas. Looking at the depositional system, the heart of the mid-continent is dolomite. It's shelf mid-dip carbonates. And as we go towards the more up-dip position, we see an interdetrital belt. As we go down to the southeast, we see a more open marine, more limestone-rich environment. Making a composite section from up-dip on the left to down-dip on the right, the red line represents the Sauk-Tippecanoe unconformity surface. We see that dolomites and sandstones intermingle up-dip. Dolomites predominate mid-dip. In alocogens, we see some limestones, and as we get into a more outer marine setting, we see dolomites and limestones. The classic example is the Franklin Mountains, and here's an exposure of the Ellenberger. Bob Goldhammer, in his great 1993 paper pointed out the high-frequency platform carbonate cycles and how there are repetitious patterns within the Ellenberger. When you take a look at the major exposure that happens at the end of the Ordovician, lower Ordovician deposition, a vast karst plain results, and this is what adds to the reservoir fabric in surprising ways. We get cave collapse, diagenesis fractures. So, from an example again in the Franklin Mountains, here are some of the collapse features in a particular collapse known as the McKelligon sag. And you can see in the center chaotic blocks with interspersed. And as you visualize this in the subsurface, this can make for some exciting hydrocarbon production. Looking at all of the different fields, most of the production occurs at the top of the Arbuckle-Ellenberger-Knox unconformity, or the Sauk-Tippecanoe unconformity. In some cases, in the up-dip portion, where the interdetrital sandstones interfinger with dolomites, stack pays can occur, and primarily in the mid-dip shelf position, there is one hydrocarbon column, and the hydrocarbons are at the very top. And as we go in the down dip, in an alacogen setting or an outer ramp setting, the dolomites that interfinger with limestones, like the brown dolomite in the Anadarko Basin, can actually occur a substantial distance from the top of the Arbuckle-Ellenberger-Knox unconformity. In the Chapter 7 of the Great American Carbonate Bank, we have at least a dozen field studies, maps and cross-sections over the many types of traps of the basin. Today we only have selected a few representative fields by those shown in the black stars, and so we'll just take a quick look at a few representative fields. Beginning in Kansas, this is the great unconformity trap that causes differential entrapment, and this has been very nicely documented by Walters 1958, and there's hydrocarbon differentiation. Oklahoma City field is another great field. This is a very large structural block, and you can see this is very typical of an incredibly high rate well that can be found in these reservoirs. And there are many other fields that are large structural blocks. So I wanted to take a moment and just sort of review some of the fundamentals and the importance of understanding the trap and seal and how it creates fluid levels within the carbonates. So about 20 years ago, I did a study at Wilburton Field in the Arkoma Basin, and it was quite a remarkable surprise after making a structure map on the top of the Arbuckle to realize that the closure was much larger than the actual gas productive area, and the column height of production was about 800 feet less than the actual mapped closure. And after making a fault plane map, it became clear that the thickness of the Simpson sandstone on the downthrown side of the fault was about 800 feet, and therefore it was a non-sealing fault seal. And so this enabled some observations about in sandy systems that encase these structures, it's very important to do trap analysis. So here's an exploration test. You can see a horse block in the middle, typical prospect, and here's the Arbuckle, top Arbuckle shown in red. And would you drill a prospect like this? And the answer is yes. Many people have, and many people continue to do so. The exploration result is many of these result in dry holes because here is the top of the Arbuckle on the upthrown side, and here's the top of the Arbuckle on the downthrown side. And laterally, the Simpson does not laterally seal. And in another case, where there's a very tall structure, the Spiro sandstone, which is a Pennsylvanian sandstone, actually touches against the Arbuckle and again produces a dry hole, making a Goldilocks effect where for Wilburton Field to work, my study concluded, which I presented at AAPG in 1993, that you need to have enough fault throw to overcome the thickness of the Simpson sand, but not too much fault throw to be juxtaposed against the spiral sandstone. And so you can see over here Wilburton Field and many Arbuckle tests both before and after Wilburton, which have not yet resulted in another gas discovery. So the lesson, I believe, is that in certain situations it's very important to do trap analysis on these blocks. And doing a study along the Ouachita thrust belt, it's clear that over in the Black Warrior and over in the east, there are carboniferous sandstones being sourced into the system that can be fault juxtaposed to the carbonate reservoirs, and that where the sands are thickest, it's more challenging to get a seal. But over in places like the Val Verde Basin and the Kerr Basin, which is not very far from Fredericksburg, where we are right now, there is a lot of good shale to potentially fault juxtapose against Arbuckle reservoirs. And this is illustrated in this diagram where good shale seals provide good traps, and where in places like the Arkoma and the Black Warrior Basin, trap analysis is even more important. And I'd like to share this slide about Captain Cook because as an explorer he had some powerful lessons for us. He didn't like heavily traveled areas, and he liked to go into lightly explored areas. And in the Pacific Ocean, he got off the beaten path and made more discoveries than any other explorer. And every once in a while, fields will come along, dramatic surprises in the Arbuckle-Ellenberger Knox, like Wilburton Field when it occurred in the early 90s, and also a field called Maben, which is in the Black Warrior Basin. Maben was about 600 miles from equivalent Great American Carbonate Bank production when it was rediscovered in 1995. And there's a very interesting history. In 1970, Texaco drilled a well and completed it as a low-volume dry gas well. And for 25 years, this well produced at marginal rates and was largely forgotten by industry. In the late 1990s, a pheноgeologist recognized that the well had virtually no decline, and subsequently, a 15,000-foot offset to the initial well came in at 5 to 6 million a day. And so today, the field has been rediscovered and has produced about 60 BCF dry gas from 9 wells. I have to share a story about Arbuckle Reservoir. When I was a geologist at Shell, I was looking at the Wilburton field, and I was amazed by how low the petrophysical porosity was. So I needed help, and I went to the best petrophysical guru at the time, a fellow named Bert Tumir, who was not Gus Archie, but he was a colleague of Gus Archie, and they had developed the famous Archie equation. And I said, Bert, I need some help. Here's a log. How can I possibly evaluate this? And he looked at it and he said, this has got less than 2% porosity for the most part, a couple of streaks of up to 9% porosity, but not very many feet of it. He said, young man, you're basically wasting my time. This is tombstone. This is not, the kind of rock that we can really do much with. And I said, well, Bert, it's already produced 43 BCF. And so Bert was a little bit surprised about that. And it made a point to me that in these cave system type reservoirs, like the Arbuckle-Ellenberger Knox, there is extreme heterogeneity. And in wells like this one depicted by wellbore A, there's basically no porosity. And in another wellbore, very nearby, you would see maybe tight 2% rock, and then you might see a streak of 20 or 30 feet of 9% rock, if you're lucky, and then basically back to tight. But the chamber that is connected laterally can bring reserves that far exceed traditional pH calculations. In fact, these reservoirs typically overperform classical petrophysical analysis. And the key today, as many operators are doing, is using horizontal wells to intersect maximum number of fractures and permeabilities zones in order to increase production. And so one of the observations is, in a lot of these old reservoirs, if you can identify core or FMI images, and you see that a karst system is active, and it almost always is somewhere in the Arbuckle-Ellenberger-Knox, then you know that you may have extreme lateral heterogeneity and that horizontal drilling might be applicable. And some of the cases of classic fields like Todd Field on the Ozona platform, which has produced 43 million barrels from vertical wells, these are the cumes from individual wells. So you can see at the crest of the structure there are some good wells, and there are also some very bad wells on the crest of the structure, less than 50,000 barrel wells, fairly tight compared to a 9.6 million barrel well. And quite startling, the best well in the field, which has produced 15 million barrels, occurs well down on the flank of the structure. So the simple rule of drilling the highest spot on the structure does not always equate to drilling the very best reservoir. I would like to acknowledge Paul Raymondetta for sharing this graphic with me. This is an example of pretty much the same thing in Butler County, Kansas. And Paul went ahead and highlighted the high initial potential rate wells in red and green. And you can see that there is a very variable fabric. And in cross-section, you can see how the karst zones contribute to that. One of the great hopes has always been that seismic imaging might help us better identify the more porous fabrics, and this is a study by Bob Loucks done in 2002 and others in quarries where I used to lead trips with, for shell geologists to the hill country, and they were able to use high-frequency seismic sparker data and determine a very northeast pattern to the reservoirs. And of course, the very tight reservoirs are parallel bedded, and the very blocky collapse features have a fabric more like the brecciated paleocave fabric shown on this seismic. And I'd like to thank Dave Ensminger from Whiting, who provided this example from a 3D recently shot in the Central Basin platform, and you can see dough lines, little collapse features on the Arbuckle surface here. And my hope is that many, many more examples of seismic are going to come forward as people shoot more and more 3D data over these old fields. So just to recap, the Arbuckle-Ellenberger-Knox, it's always important to focus on reservoirs and traps below the Sauk-Tippecanoe unconformity. That trap analysis on fault closures and horse blocks can help identify hydrocarbon traps, and in some cases it's extremely important to do that. Some of the greatest surprises, and I'm sure there will be many more to come, will occur around oil and gas show wells that have made some amount of gas, but that may exhibit limited or no decline curve. As an industry, we need to seek these out. And we shouldn't be afraid to get off the beaten path. Remember Captain Cook. Arbuckle-Ellenberger-Knox discoveries have and will continue to occur in places that many of us least expected. And we hope with new technology like directional drilling, and hopefully seismic as well, that we can do a better job anticipating fractures in karst-related fabrics so that we can produce more from these wonderful reservoirs. And so I'd like to end with a thank you to AAPG, my Great American Carbonate Bank colleagues, co-editors, friends of the Cambrian and Ordovician, exploration partners who have been on the journey with me as we drilled many wells over the years, and inspirations like James Lee Wilson, Jerry Friedman, and Jet Rink, who keeps me focused every day on the bottom line.